I always believed that life after a certain age settles into something predictable. Not boring, exactly, but steady, familiar, the kind of rhythm you can follow with your eyes closed. Mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons filled with small chores, evenings with the quiet hum of the television and my husband beside me, half listening, half dozing. That was my life, and for the most part, I was content with it. It was a Tuesday when everything began to shift, though at the time it didn't feel like anything unusual. Just another small inconvenience in a long list of ordinary days. The kitchen sink had been acting up for weeks. Slow drainage, a faint metallic smell, and that constant, irritating drip that seemed louder at night. My husband, Richard, had promised to fix it, of course. He always did, but like many of his promises lately, it kept getting pushed to tomorrow. That morning, as I stood there watching the water stubbornly swirl without going down, I felt a flicker of frustration I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't really about the sink. "Call Daniel," Richard said later, barely looking up from his phone. "He knows plumbing better than I do." Daniel, his friend from years back. They used to work together, though I had only met him a handful of times. Brief visits, polite conversations, nothing memorable. I remembered he had a calm presence, observant, maybe a little reserved, the kind of man who didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. "I don't want to bother him," I said. "You're not bothering him," Richard replied. "He likes fixing things, gives him something to do." There was something about that answer that lingered with me, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way he said it so casually, as if inviting someone else into our space was no different than calling a repair service. Still, by early afternoon, I found myself dialing the number. Daniel arrived just before 4. I remember the way the light came through the front windows when I opened the door, soft and golden, catching the edges of his jacket as he stepped inside. "Hope I'm not too late," he said, offering a small, polite smile. "Not at all," I replied. "Thank you for coming." Up close, he looked a little older than I remembered, not in a tired way, but in a lived-in way. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a steadiness in how he carried himself. There was something grounding about him, something that made the house feel quieter, somehow. I led him to the kitchen, apologizing for the mess even though everything was in its usual place. He waved it off, already rolling up his sleeves as he crouched beneath the sink. "You'd be surprised what I've seen," he said lightly. I laughed, more out of politeness than anything, and leaned against the counter, watching as he worked. There's something strangely intimate about having someone fix something in your home. They see parts of your life you don't usually show, the worn edges, the little imperfections. For a while we didn't talk much, just the sound of tools, the occasional clink of metal, the steady rhythm of someone focused on a task. Then, almost without thinking, I asked, "Do you still enjoy this kind of work?" He paused just for a second. "I do," he said. "It's simple. You see a problem, you fix it. Not everything in life works that way." There was something in his tone that made me straighten slightly. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like quiet acceptance. "I suppose that's true," I said. He glanced up at me then, just briefly, and in that moment, I felt something shift. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle awareness, like noticing a change in the air before a storm. "Richard said you've been busy," he added. "Yes," I replied. "We both have, in our own ways." It wasn't entirely true, and I think we both knew it. As he returned to his work, I found myself studying the small details, the careful way he handled each part, the patience in his movements. It had been a long time since I had paid attention like that to anyone. "Should be done soon," he said after a while. "No rush," I answered a little too quickly. He smiled faintly, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Outside, the light had started to fade, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor. The house felt different somehow, not unfamiliar, but not entirely the same either. I didn't know it then, but that quiet afternoon, with its small conversation and unspoken pauses, was the beginning of something I hadn't expected, something I wasn't even sure I was ready to understand. And yet, standing there in my own kitchen, watching a man fix a simple problem, I felt something inside me begin to wake up. By the time Daniel finished under the sink, the light outside had turned that soft gray-blue that comes just before evening settles in, the kind of light that makes everything feel quieter than it really is. "There we go," he said, tightening one last connection before turning the water back on. The sink gurgled for a moment, then cleared, smooth, steady, no resistance. I let out a small breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That sounds better already. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands with a cloth he pulled from his pocket. It should hold now. The pipe was partially clogged, and the seal was worn out. I nodded, though I wasn't really thinking about pipes anymore. "Can I get you something? Coffee, maybe?" I asked. He hesitated, just briefly. Coffee would be nice. It surprised me how relieved I felt when he said yes. I moved around the kitchen with a kind of quiet awareness, suddenly conscious of small things, the sound of the kettle, the way the cups touched the counter, even the way I brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. It had been a long time since I'd noticed. Not that Daniel was staring or making me uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. His presence was respectful, steady, but it carried a kind of attention I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We sat at the small table by the window, the same place Richard and I had shared countless routine conversations over the years. But this felt different, not louder or more exciting, just more present. "So," Daniel said, wrapping his hands around the cup, "how have you been?" "Really?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unusual, but because of the way he asked it, like he actually meant it. "I've been fine," I said at first, then gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I suppose that's what people always say." He nodded slightly. "It's an easy answer." I looked out the window for a moment, watching as a car passed slowly down the street. "Life gets quiet," I said. "You don't always notice it happening. One day you're busy with everything, work, plans, people, and then it just slows down. And you're not sure what to do with the silence," he added. I turned back to him, a little surprised. "Yes, exactly." For a moment, neither of us spoke, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt understood. "Richard used to tell me you were always the one who kept things moving," Daniel said. "Plans, gatherings, you had energy." I let out a soft laugh. "That feels like a different person now." "People don't just lose that," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just waits." There it was again, that subtle shift, not in what he said, but in how it landed, like he was seeing something in me I hadn't looked at in years. I found myself studying him more openly now. The calm in his expression, the way he listened without interrupting, without rushing to fill the space. It made me realize how long it had been since I'd had a conversation that didn't feel like it was on autopilot. "Do you ever feel that way?" I asked. "Like parts of your life are just waiting?" He smiled faintly, but there was something thoughtful behind it, more often than I'd like to admit. We shared a quiet moment after that, both of us holding on to something unspoken, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just real. I stood up to refill his coffee, more out of instinct than necessity. As I reached for his cup, our hands brushed, just lightly, barely a second. But it lingered. "Sorry," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to apologize. "It's all right," he replied, just as softly. When I sat back down, something had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to or explained, but the air felt different, warmer, maybe, or closer. "You've taken good care of this place," he said, glancing around. "Thank you," I replied. "It's been my focus, I suppose." "It shows." I nodded, though part of me wondered if that was enough, if maintaining a home, keeping everything in order, had quietly become my entire world without me noticing. "You know," I said after a moment, "I didn't realize how much I missed talking like this." He looked at me, not surprised, just present. Neither did I. The honesty in that moment settled between us, steady and undeniable. Outside, the sky had darkened completely now, the reflection of the room faintly visible in the window. For a brief second, I caught sight of us sitting there, two people at a table, sharing something simple but meaningful. It should have felt ordinary, but it didn't. And as I sat there, across from a man who had only come to fix a broken sink, I began to understand that something inside me was shifting, not suddenly, not recklessly, but quietly and with intention. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt awake enough to find out. The clock on the wall read a little past 6, though it felt later. Time had taken on that strange, stretched quality, like the evening was holding itself in place, unwilling to move forward too quickly. "I should probably head out," Daniel said, glancing toward the door, though he didn't stand up right away. "Yes, of course," I replied, but the words didn't carry much weight, not even to my own ears. Neither of us moved for a moment. It wasn't awkward. It was something else entirely, like both of us were aware that stepping away from that table meant ending something we hadn't fully understood yet. "Richard usually gets home around this time, doesn't he?" he asked. "Later," I said. "He mentioned he'd be working late tonight." I hadn't meant for that to sound significant, but the moment it left my mouth, I felt it settle between us. Daniel gave a small nod, taking that in without commenting on it. That was something I had come to notice about him. He didn't rush to fill silence or attach meaning where it wasn't offered, but he understood it when it was there. I stood up, more to break the stillness than anything else. "Let me at least walk you to the door." He followed, slow and unhurried, as if there was no real urgency behind leaving. The hallway felt different than it had earlier, narrower somehow, more aware of the space we were sharing. I could hear the faint creak of the floor beneath our steps, the soft hum of the house settling into evening. When we reached the door, I turned to him, offering a polite smile that felt thinner than before. "Thank you again, for the sink and the company." He returned the smile, but there was something deeper behind it now. "You don't have to thank me for that." Another pause. It would have been easy to end things there. A simple goodbye, a step out the door, and the evening would fold back into something ordinary. But neither of us seemed ready to let it be that simple. "I meant what I said earlier," he added, "about people not losing parts of themselves." I felt a small shift in my chest, something between appreciation and uncertainty. It's been a long time since anyone said something like that to me. "Maybe it's been a long time since someone was paying attention," he replied. His words weren't bold or inappropriate. They were quiet, careful, but they reached something in me I hadn't realized had been waiting. I looked down for a second, collecting my thoughts, then met his gaze again. "It's strange," I said slowly, "how a normal day can suddenly feel different." He nodded. "It doesn't take much, just the right moment, I guess." "And the right person?" I asked before I could stop myself. The question lingered in the air, softer than it sounded, but impossible to take back. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, steady, thoughtful, respectful, said enough. "I think it takes honesty," he said finally, "even if it's just with yourself." I let out a small breath, feeling the weight of that settle in. He wasn't pushing, wasn't crossing any lines. If anything, he was giving me space to understand what I was feeling rather than telling me what it meant. And that somehow made it more real. "I don't usually," I started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. "Neither do I," he said gently. There was a quiet understanding in that exchange, one that didn't need to be defined or rushed. I reached for the door handle, but my hand paused there for just a second longer than necessary. "This doesn't have to be a one-time visit," I said, keeping my voice calm, even as I felt my heartbeat pick up slightly. "I mean, if anything else needs fixing." A small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Things tend to need fixing more often than we expect. I smiled back, recognizing the meaning beneath the words without needing to say it out loud. When I finally opened the door, the cool evening air slipped inside, brushing against my skin. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, then turned back toward me. "Take care," he said. "You too," I replied. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other. No rush, no pressure, just acknowledgement. Then he nodded once and walked down the path, his figure gradually fading into the dim light of the street. I closed the door gently, leaning against it for a second as the quiet of the house returned, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It felt fuller. I walked back into the kitchen, glancing at the sink out of habit. The steady, clean flow of water was a small, practical reminder that something had been fixed. But that wasn't the only thing that had changed. I sat down at the table again, looking at the second coffee cup still resting across from mine. The room carried the faint warmth of our conversation, like an echo that hadn't quite faded. For years I had moved through my days without questioning them, without asking myself if there was more to feel, more to experience, more to understand about who I was becoming. But now, something had shifted. Not in a reckless or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, undeniable one. And as I sat there, alone but not quite the same as before, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't just about Daniel. It was about me. About something I had set aside a long time ago, something that was now, slowly and carefully, finding its way back. The next morning felt unfamiliar in the most subtle way. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same pale light filtered through the curtains, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen, and the same routine waited for me to step into it. But I didn't move through it the same way. I stood by the sink for a moment, turning the faucet on just to watch the water run smoothly. No resistance, no noise. It worked perfectly, simple, reliable. Fixed. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I found myself thinking about everything else that wasn't as easy to repair. "Looks like Daniel did a good job," Richard said as he walked in, loosening his tie. He barely glanced at the sink before pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Yes," I replied, watching him. "He did." "That's why I called him. Always dependable," he added, already scrolling through his phone again. Dependable. The word stayed with me longer than it should have, not because it was wrong, but because it felt incomplete. "Did you stay while he fixed it?" Richard asked, almost as an afterthought. "I did," I said. "We talked for a bit." He nodded, distracted. "Good guy. Keeps to himself mostly." I waited, expecting something more, a question, maybe even a small curiosity about how the afternoon had gone. But nothing came. The conversation ended as quickly as it had started. And that, more than anything, made the difference clear. Later that day, after Richard left again, the house settled into its usual stillness. But I didn't reach for the television or my phone. Instead, I found myself sitting at the same table, tracing the rim of my coffee cup, replaying moments I hadn't expected to matter so much. It wasn't anything dramatic. No grand gestures, no lines crossed. Just attention, presence, honesty. I realized then how rare those things had become in my life. Before I could overthink it, I stood up and walked to the small drawer by the hallway table. Inside, among old receipts and folded papers, was a piece of paper with Daniel's number written on it. I had placed it there without much thought the day before. Now it felt like something more deliberate. I held it for a moment, considering, not rushing, not acting on impulse, just being honest with myself. Then I picked up the phone. He answered on the third ring. "Hello." "Hi, Daniel. It's me." There was a brief pause, then a quiet recognition in his voice. "I was wondering if I might hear from you." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh. "I hope that's not a bad thing." "Not at all." I leaned lightly against the wall, grounding myself. "I was just calling to say thank you again, and to let you know everything's still working perfectly." "I'm glad to hear that," he said, though I had a feeling the call might not just be about the sink. There was no pressure in his words, just openness. "No," I admitted, "it's not." Silence followed, but it felt different from the silences I was used to. It wasn't empty. It was patient. "I've been thinking," I continued slowly, choosing my words with care, "about what you said, about parts of ourselves waiting." "And?" he asked gently. "I think you were right," I said, "and I think I stopped paying attention to that part of me a long time ago." "That happens," he replied. "Life gets busy, then it gets quiet, and somewhere in between, we forget to check in with ourselves." His voice was steady, never guiding me in a direction, just walking beside me as I figured things out. "I don't want to do that anymore," I said, more firmly this time. There it was, not a declaration of anything inappropriate or impulsive, just a simple truth I hadn't said out loud before. "I understand," he said. We spoke for a while after that. Nothing that would raise eyebrows, nothing that crossed lines, but everything we said carried meaning. About change, about time, about how easy it is to settle into something comfortable and forget that comfort isn't the same as fulfillment. When the call ended, I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. That evening, when Richard came home, I met him in the living room instead of staying in the kitchen. "We should talk," I said. He looked surprised, setting his keys down. "About what?" "About us," I replied calmly. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just honesty. We sat down, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't let the conversation stay on the surface. I spoke about the quiet, about the distance, about how we had both, in our own ways, stopped showing up fully. He listened, really listened, and though it wasn't an easy conversation, it was a necessary one. Nothing was solved in a single evening. That's not how real life works, but something had started. And later that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the most unexpected part of all of this wasn't Daniel coming over to fix the sink. It was what that simple moment had uncovered. Not a secret, not a mistake, but a reminder that even after years of routine, even after things have settled into something quiet and predictable, it's still possible to feel again, to notice, to question, to grow. And sometimes all it takes is someone knocking on your door for an entirely ordinary reason, only for the situation to change in a way you never saw coming. Not because of what happens between two people, but because of what finally awakens within you. I didn't expect everything to feel different the next day, but it did. Not in a dramatic, life-altering way. The house was the same, the streets outside unchanged, the rhythm of the morning just as steady as it had always been. But there was a quiet clarity in me now, a sense that I was no longer simply moving through my days, but actually noticing them. Richard and I had spoken more in that one evening than we had in months, maybe longer. It hadn't been perfect, and it certainly hadn't solved everything, but it had opened something that had been closed for too long. He tried in his own way the following days, small things at first, sitting with me a little longer at breakfast, asking questions he might not have asked before, even offering to fix a loose cabinet door without being reminded. I noticed it, and more importantly, I appreciated it. But clarity has a way of bringing honesty with it, and honesty doesn't always let you go back to seeing things the way you used to. A few days later, I found myself back at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, the same soft light stretching across the floor. My hand rested near my phone, not uncertain this time, just thoughtful. When I called Daniel, it wasn't out of impulse. It was intention. "Hello," he answered, his voice as calm as I remembered. "Hi," I said, a small smile forming without me realizing. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not." There was that same steadiness, that same sense that he was fully present in the moment. "I was thinking," I said, "there's a small shelf in the hallway that's been loose for a while. I thought maybe you could take a look at it." A brief pause followed, not hesitation, but understanding. "I could do that," he replied. "Only if you have time," I added. "I'll make time." We agreed on the next afternoon. When he arrived, it didn't feel like the first visit, but it didn't feel casual either. There was an awareness between us now, clearer, more defined, but still respectful. "Good to see you," he said as I opened the door. "You too," I replied. The words were simple, but they carried something more grounded this time. Less uncertainty, more understanding. I showed him the shelf and he set to work, just as before, focused, patient, careful. But the silence between us wasn't the same as it had been that first day. It wasn't about unfamiliarity anymore. It was about choice. "You spoke to him," he said after a while, not looking up from his work. "I did," I answered. "And?" I took a moment before responding. It was needed. He nodded slightly as if that told him everything he needed to know. "I'm not here to complicate anything," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." "I do," I replied. "That's not what this is." And it wasn't. That was the difference. What had begun as an unexpected moment hadn't turned into something careless or hidden. If anything, it had made me more honest with myself and with the life I was already living. When he finished, we didn't rush to sit down this time. Instead, we stood there for a moment in the hallway, the late afternoon light slipping through the window nearby. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome." A pause followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was calm, certain. "You helped more than you realize," I added. He met my eyes then, steady as always. Sometimes people just need a reminder. The rest is up to them. I smiled slightly. "I think you're right." We walked to the door together, just like before. But this time there was no unspoken tension about what might or might not happen. There was clarity. Respect. Understanding. "Take care," he said as he stepped outside. "You too, Daniel." And as I watched him walk away, I didn't feel that same pull to hold on to the moment or wonder what it meant. I already knew. I closed the door and stood there for a second, listening to the quiet of the house. But it wasn't the same quiet anymore. It didn't feel empty. It felt steady. Later that evening, Richard and I sat together on the couch, not out of habit, but because we chose to. The conversation wasn't extraordinary, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Life hadn't suddenly become perfect. It rarely does. But something had shifted into place. And as I leaned back, listening to the familiar sounds of the evening, I realized that what had changed wasn't my circumstances. It was my awareness of them. Sometimes the most unexpected moments don't lead you away from your life. They lead you back to it, with clearer eyes, a steadier heart, and a deeper understanding of what truly matters.